And welcome to Halloween series. This is the one that has nothing to do with the other movies, but we gotta talk about it. We are talking today Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, which is the third installment in the Halloween 3 series. This is a film that I watched for the first time this weekend, and boy oh boy do we have a lot of thoughts about this movie, because this is the most tonally different from any Halloween films, because it's the only film within the series, within the franchise, that does not have Michael Myers playing a part in this movie. For those of you who do not know, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch follows just that. They're witches. This film is directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who was the editor for Halloween and Halloween 2. This also is produced by Deborah Hill and John Carpenter. However, it is written by Tommy Lee Wallace again. This film does not feature the returns of Jamie Lee Curtis, of any of the original cast members. This is a film that stars Tom Atkins, Stacey Nelkin, and Dan O'Halloran, I believe is how you pronounce his name. Carpenter does come back along with Deborah Hill to produce this movie. Carpenter does the score for this movie. This film is released in 1982, in October of 1982, and it is made on a budget of $2.5 million, makes $14.4 million, and it's the last attempt Universal ever considers of making a Halloween movie without Michael Myers in it. There's a lot to be said about this movie, and I think the most interesting aspects of this movie is how it relates to the first movie and how it relates to the Carpenter of it all. With me again, like I said, is roommate Tris, here to talk about Halloween 3. Are you ready?
I am ready. And first of all, there are some returning cast members that Annie,
yeah, isn't there? There's like one or two, right?
there's Annie from the first two movies. She is now playing an adult wife.
But she's not Annie, correct?
She's not Annie.
Yeah.
And Jamie Lee Curtis is playing a announcer over an intercom.
Yes, and Dick Warlock's in this movie, but not as Michael Myers.
Yes. So we got some original cast.
This movie is an interesting product of the 1980s and John Carpenter. We just spent the last episode talking about how Halloween 2 feels at times it is John Carpenter
regretting
/ not knowing how to make Halloween 2. Here's the thing about Halloween 3, and we'll get into it and why I think this. This is definitely more tonally in line with John Carpenter's work.
Yes.
Because for those of you who do not know, you're listening to this and you're like, why is Halloween 3 not have Michael Myers in this? Like, what is this film? Why does it exist in the way it does? The idea John Carpenter had for Halloween was each year was going to change. You could make 30 different Halloween movies, and they'd all, in theory, be about different characters, about different subjects, different villains. It was an anthology. This is the first film that really embraces the anthology nature of it, and they never tried again because of just how weirdly received this movie is. And it's when you're looking back at it, it's a failure by all accounts. This film is a failure, box office wise, largely script wise. There's so much just wrong with this film. But there's something very interesting about this film in looking at it to how people respond to Carpenter's legacy in filmmaking and how they also try to take hold of Carpenter's filmmaking. It's a interesting push or pull of, are we too in the mind of Carpenter, or are we paying homage to Carpenter? And that's the task that this film has to have. Having this film directed and written by Tommy Lee Wallace, the editor of Halloween and Halloween 2, makes the film feel very much like the first Halloween in a lot of its beats. But it's largely unsuccessful. Like I said, this is my first time seeing the film.
Which I had no idea, by the way.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen it all the way through. I've seen six sections and beats of this film. I knew largely what this film was about. This is the first time I sat on my couch, watched from beginning to end. And there's a lot of thoughts about it, and there's things I really respect about this film. There's things that I like. There's also things that are atrocious in this film. How many times would you say you've seen this film?
I've seen
Uh,
this movie 6 times.
6 times?
Yeah.
Is this one of
I
the, like, in terms of Halloween films, where would that put it on for your amount watched viewing experiences? Like, is
oh
this
I
middle? Is this high? Is this very low?
I typically skip this one.
Okay.
I've The only reason why I've watched it more recently is because I'm showing it to people who have never seen it before,
Mhm.
or I'm watching it for this. But
Yeah.
before this year, I had only seen this movie 2 or 3 times,
Hmm.
and it's never been one of my favorites. I enjoy some things about it, and I guess we'll get into that later. But in the large part, I don't particularly enjoy these kind of horror movies.
Hmm. I There is a lot that I can say about this movie. I think let's just kind of start with what the premise of this movie is. Tris, I'll kind of just don't break down beat for beat what this movie is, but just give a general overview of like what this is the story that we're focusing in on for this because it's a
Um,
very different Halloween story. Unlike the other 12, this does not follow any of the same conventions of Michael Myers Halloween.
I don't here.
Just yeah, read the back cover because that's probably the best way of
Uh,
describing it.
well, I don't remember any of the character names because this isn't one of my favorites. But do you want me to actually read
You know,
the back?
honestly, it might not be a bad idea to just read the back cover.
When a terrified toy salesman is mysteriously attacked and brought to the hospital, babbling and clutching the year's most popular Halloween costume, an eerie pumpkin mask, Dr. Daniel Chalice, played by Atkins from The Fog and Night of the Creeps, is thrust into a terrifying Halloween nightmare. Working with the salesman's daughter, Ellie, played by Stacey Nelkin, Daniel traces the mask to Silver Shamrock Novelties Company and its founder, Connell Cochran, played by Dan O'Harley. O'Harley? RoboCop?
Oh, is it
Um,
actually him?
yeah, that's him.
Oh shoot, I
And
didn't
then,
realize that. You're
yeah,
totally right though.
Ellie and Daniel uncover Cochran's shocking Halloween plan and must stop him before trick-or-treaters across the country are kept from ever coming home in this terrifying thriller from writer-director Tommy Lee Wallace, who also directed Stephen King's It, the 90s one.
Yeah, this Tommy Lee Wallace has a rather interesting career. He is a collaborator with John Carpenter for sure. He works on a lot of films with Carpenter, including Dark Star, The Fog, obviously the original Halloween films. He's a guy that, like I said, he's really tied his career to it. He's done a little bit of horror since. He did a movie like Fright Night Part 2. I don't. This is the hardest one for me to start on because I don't know where to start on
That's
this
fair.
movie. How do you want to start on this movie, Tris?
Um, well, we can start as any good movie starts, and with an attempted murder.
Yeah, and like I
Not even
said,
murder, an
mm,
attempted murder.
yeah, there. Yeah, this film. I'm trying to think where. Like, yeah, I guess we just start there. Do you know the biggest issue I'm having with this movie? I saw this
What?
movie 3 days ago, and I don't really remember what's this movie's like.
That's
Any of the
because
big scenes of this movie.
this movie is boring. This
Yeah,
movie is slow, but not in a way that like John Carpenter's Halloween is slow. It's like
yeah, it's a movie
you
that
take
is 98 minutes. That feels like
uh-huh,
2 hours.
uh-huh.
Let's.
And
Mhm,
Tommy Lee Wallace, I like his some of his other work. Like I like his It special,
mhm.
but I don't love how he directs in this movie at all. I don't like the tangents we go on. kills happen in this movie, and I just don't care. You know, like
Yeah, let's. Okay, let's. I figured out how we're going to start this movie off. There is obviously the first murder in this movie. Basically, the main character is a doctor. He has this weird relationship with his family.
every woman, he has
Every woman.
he has this weird relationship with every woman in this cast.
Yeah, and there's something disconcerting about this guy. He seems a little weird, a little creepy. He gets called to the hospital. There is apparently this woman who dies, and her face is kind of like, is it melted onto her or something like that? And she's found with this mask, right?
No, so we have this male character who
Male character.
is, and he's running with this pumpkin mask, and he's in the hospital, and he's saying that they're coming, and a robot comes. We don't know it's a robot, but spoiler, it's a robot. Comes and rips his face apart, for lack of a better term, and then proceeds to blow itself up in a car.
Yeah, that is right. That is how this movie starts. You know what? I'm having like a lot of difficulty talking about this movie, so let me just hit on some of the points that I do think are the most interesting to just wrap a conversation around, because ultimately you're getting it already from Tris and I that there's not a ton to actually talk about in this movie. This film is wild, but for not particularly exciting reasons. It's more of just the novelty and weirdness of this movie when you're watching it.
Hmm.
This whole opening scene that you're talking about, the one thing that I actually found interesting about the filmmaking is how much of an early predecessor it is to modern day horror, in the sense that like this is the type of kill or death that would happen in a film like A24. Like it felt very similar to deaths that happen in the movie Hereditary. It's because like it's so like shocking, it's so weird. It kind of leaves you wondering, not much as the scared feeling, it's more of like the WTF am I watching
Hmm.
feeling. So there's something interesting about this, that like he hits on a topic that will then later be discussed in the 21st century. This is what horror looks like. This is how weird it is, and the horror can be found in the unknown rather than the scary. And that's where the
I
horror bases itself in.
I don't want to completely discount your analysis, but I think you're giving this movie a little too much credit.
It might be accidental. I think it's
Okay.
largely accidental, but when I am watching this scene, I am kind of just left with this feeling of what is going on? This is really weird. This is maybe even a little just like almost like feels like self parody. And it's the weird thing when I'm watching this, I'm like, does this film actually play better? Like, if this film comes out in 2022, does it make more headlines? Is it more critically revered? Are there people who like it more? And it's not because, again, necessarily that this movie's good, but I think it does play more into the modern day sensibility of horror. And that's the aspect of the movie that I'm like, I'm grappling with it, where I'm like, I'm seeing a filmmaker try something that is so aggressively not working from beginning to end for me. I don't like this film. But I'm also grappling with something where I'm like, okay, my biggest issue with Halloween 2 is the movie just loses all understanding of what the first Halloween movie is. And this third one makes the case of like, okay, what if we took what made the first one great? Like, what if we took some of those Carpenter aspects and then just like kind of did our own thing with it? So, like, let's have the same idea. It's a character being stalked on Halloween, being killed by this creature that no one really knows anything about. It has this overarching religious, not religious but cult undertone, because it's from the Sadism, I believe. Is that how it's pronounced? What's the cult that resurrects, not that Michael Myers is supposedly a part of, or not even a part of, but it's the cult that he's a demon from? They talk about it in
Sam
Halloween.
Hay.
Sam Hain. That is like this. They
That's a
make
holiday.
yes, they make direct references to that in this movie as well,
Hmm.
and that's like the interesting part of this movie. I would almost contend that this movie like it tries something and it's so aggressively bad, but it's not. It's never mediocre to me. It's it's bad. It's really bad indeed. But I'm like watching it. I'm like I almost respect what he's doing.
To me, this is a movie that if Mystery Science Theater hasn't done an episode on, it definitely should. You know what I mean?
It's the weirdest mainstream. Sorry, not the weirdest mainstream. It is the weirdest horror film to come out of a mainstream franchise ever. Just period. You could maybe even make the case it's the weirdest film to come out of a franchise, period. This film
Yeah.
is baffling on every technical level. And it also just like, but what I can see in this film is something that almost understands what the genre is going to become. There's something foreshadowing about how this film is directed. This film is very self referential. This very much pokes fun at its own existence and the existence of Halloween to the point where we see Michael Myers, John Carpenter's Halloween literally on the screen. This is so self referential to the point of Craven. It feels like Wes Craven in Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street as the series again kind of goes on. There's these moments of it when you're watching this film where I'm just like, God, maybe he has an idea of what horror is evolving into. And of course, this film doesn't work because the evolution is not there, and this guy is not a Wes Craven mind. He just simply is not Wes Craven. But he has an interest that's different than that of Carpenter. Carpenter is very much this is what a mainstream horror film looks like. I'm still using the conventions of Hitchcock. I am still using the Universal horror films from the 1930s as kind of an idea. This guy is just like, what if horror was mixed with science fiction? And it's interesting too, because Carpenter takes this approach too. Carpenter is this movie is more aligned with Carpenter's work of the 1980s than you would say Halloween is.
Yes. Like especially like The Thing
The Thing, The
or even
Fog,
like
Prince of Darkness, like all of
Little
these
Trouble in Little China, you know?
yeah,
Or Big
there's
Trouble in Little China.
it has this really biting sense of humor. And again, the humor doesn't work in this film, but it's someone trying to be it. And it's so interesting to watch. This isn't like the Halloween Chew is the film about a filmmaker trying to understand what makes Carpenter and completely failing to understand what makes Carpenter. This guy is a guy who's edited for Carpenter basically his whole life. He understands what Carpenter is, he understands what Carpenter's philosophy is as a filmmaker, and yet when he makes the film, he's like, okay, I want to make something Carpenter light, but not Carpenter. And how do I do that? Let's infuse this with the things I'm interested in. What if I do more of a Twilight Zone approach? This guy's a little bit younger than Carpenter. He's watching Twilight Zone. He's watching shows movies like Star Trek. You know, he's probably more inclined to understand what's going on with like Star Wars. You know, there's just these
Hmm.
all these ideas that he's probably more interested in. And he's like, what if I make a Twilight Zone movie? Like this idea of like this is an anthology. Let's make it like the Twilight Zone. And Carpenter kind of feels inspired like that. Is there any truth to anything I'm saying? Or is it just
No,
me
there's
trying to overread a movie that doesn't deserve to be overread?
I definitely think that is what they're going for. Like that is the heart of this movie, is that we're trying to make a Twilight Zone anthology special as opposed to continuing on the exact themes of the previous two movies. I just think that this movie would have probably done infinitely more successfully if it was just called Season of the Witch.
I I
I just
wonder
don't.
about that. I
I
That's an
don't.
interesting point. Kind of defend that point because I want to hear more about this and chew on it.
Well, imagine if this movie came out and it was just Season of the Witch. It wasn't a part of this, and it was just a movie that John Carpenter produced, so it would be in his wheelhouse like The Thing. It would still have all the issues. It would still have everything that is wrong with the movie,
Yeah.
but we don't have. We're not watching this immediately after Halloween 2. We're not automatically putting it into perspective of what
We don't
John Carpenter is doing
You're
in
right. We
Halloween.
don't have to compare it to 1978 or even for that fact 1981. It's
Uh
allowed to
huh.
exist on its own. You know what's so interesting when I'm watching this movie, Tris? The thing that I find so interesting is this idea that I kind of hinted at earlier. This is the movie John Carpenter, like I said, he doesn't write this movie. I was shocked to find out he doesn't write this movie because this feels much more like the movie that John Carpenter wants to make. I mean, the most interesting thing about this idea that Carpenter wanted to do a basically anthology movie every year that never had to relate to Michael Myers could be its own thing. Carpenter does that. It's just not in the context of Halloween. But
Uh
those
huh.
premises, had this film been successful, do you get a movie called Halloween The Thing, Halloween Fog, Halloween Prince of Darkness, like Halloween They Live? Like, are those movies that he's already based in his career? Do those just become Halloween movies? Like, is The Thing essentially his idea of a Halloween movie set in the Arctic?
Well, I think like a modern idea of what their idea was is like American Horror Story, where every
Yeah,
season is its
anything
own
anthology.
thing. Well, like specifically with horror.
Yeah, of course. And that's a probably a very good comparison. Like I said, it's the guy, it's so weird. And I wonder how much of this film's failure inspires Carpenter's later half of his career, where he's just like, you know what? I have to kind of make my own thing because you know what this movie is? It's a sheep in wolf's clothing when you're watching this movie because this movie's so much more interesting if it's a body horror film. But it tries to exist
Uh,
within the constraints of a slasher film. And it doesn't pull off the slasher thing well, but if you just tweak the film a little bit, if you do more of this weird, if you do the more of the disgusting body horror, again, very similar to the practical effects, the creature designs of the thing, you arguably have a movie that has an identity.
but that's not what we get. We get this mess.
Yeah, and but that's the point of it, like, right? Because you're watching it and you're just like, okay, they don't embrace that. They want to have it exist in the Halloween thing, and it's that point you brought up earlier, where it's like, if we just remove this from the idea of what a Halloween movie is, and allowed this general story to play out the same way it does, but without the constraints of Halloween binding it, is there actually something interesting to this movie? And that's where I'm grappling with. If I was to remove all the Halloween essence of this movie, the idea of the slasher kills, the stalking, the long shots, the tracking shots, all of that, if I was to remove all of that and just be like, this is still the same general story, just told in the confines of, a body horror, something more in line with The Thing or The Fog or any of other Carpenter's work, is this movie actually interesting? I don't know yet.
I,
I can't tell if the issue with the movie is the script fully or if it's just the direction and approach and the idea of this movie as a whole. I don't know which one fails this movie more.
I think what doesn't help either. So let's say you took all of what you set out.
Yeah.
What you're left with is still the plot and the characters. And I think the plot and the premise is interesting. Like it's so out there, you can't not call it interesting. But the
It's so
characters,
risky, right?
yeah, but the characters are what really bring it down for me. Like our main character is a dirtbag,
Yeah, he is truly just an awful guy. And there's
and
no
then
interest in following this terrible guy.
And there's hardly any interest with, um, I think her name's Ellie. Yeah, with Ellie, apart from she's trying to find out what happened to her dad. But other than that, you don't connect with her to the same degree that you would connect with like a Laurie Strode or to another horror protagonist.
This film's not concerned about having a protagonist. This film's not interested in the final act of how do they overcome. This film is so interested in the idea of like, how can we be weird? How can we be different? How can this film be so tonally opposite of anything we've seen in Halloween yet still exists? And what ultimately they forget about, and it's this idea that I mentioned of stealing the slasher genre for this film when it's in reality not a slasher film. It is much more resemblance to a body horror film, if anything. One of these films with a
Hmm.
lot of special effects horror in it. The issue that ends up coming is they're now left with these characters who are the slasher prototypes, right? Like this
Hmm.
main male character who's played by, what is the actor's name again? What's it say on the box? He's a
Tom Atkins.
Tom Atkins, who's I'm pretty sure is actually a fairly well-known actor.
He's a well-known screen horror movie actor.
Yeah, he's a guy that's worked with, I mean, all the best. He's worked with Carpenter, he's worked with Shane Black, he's worked with Fred Decker, Richard Donner, Stephen King, George A. Romero. Like the guy's been around for a while working with these actors. The issue that his performance has in this movie, and I'm not even saying that he's a bad performer in this movie, it's just that there's no way to use this character in anything that is interesting because this character ultimately has to exist as a guy who needs to fit the slasher prototype character, which means it's this ill conceived notion from the beginning of this movie of, again, and it's the point that I bring up, does this movie actually work if it's not a slasher movie? Like if they just rewrite Tom Atkins and they're like, this guy's kind of a dirtbag who's going through this adventure trying to unlock what it is, instead of this guy feels like he's being chased down at every second by these leprechaun weirdo mass things, cyborgs. I mean, we can get into all of that in a second because the actual creation of the monsters in this movie, I think, also really leave a lot to be desired. But that's where I'm wondering, and that's where I struggle with this movie. How much of this is just a bad idea because of what they're trying to do in the Halloween series?
I think being weird for the sake of weird just can really bite you in the ass because there's no sense, there's no stakes. It's just one weird idea after another, and then Stonehenge, and then
Yeah,
did you just remember that Stonehenge is in this
no,
movie?
I remember that pretty well actually. I get that
Eh,
is the phrase that you bring up there, like one after the other, and then it all just bites you in the ass. If you just kind of compile weird, nothing's weird. It's the whole thing. If you have a bunch of neurotic characters in a movie, no one's actually
Uh-huh.
neurotic in the movie. They're all just them. And that's the issue with this movie too, and it's a really good point to bring up. Every character in this movie is just straight up like, or not every character, sorry, every decision in this movie is just like, what's the weirdest take we can have in this
Hmm.
one particular scene? How's the weirdest we can write this? How's the weirdest we can direct slash film this? What's the weirdest thing that these characters would be doing in response to all of it? And that's, you're right, because the reason like Carpenter's other films like The Thing are more successful. The Thing is a weird movie inherently. But what the thing that's so genius about The Thing is that creature, that idea of the thing is so weird. And then everyone else is having normal responses of how do you fight the thing? This is like, okay, let's have this weird leprechaun cyborg. Let's have this weird subplot with Stonehenge. Let's have this tie into the Halloween series with the cult that we've talked about in Halloween 2. Let's have this all also be like a self parody of Halloween and an understanding and almost a wink of the eye of what Halloween is by referencing John Carpenter and Halloween specifically. Let's have this be a Twilight Zone, but like one of those really weird ones where it's just like everything goes off the hand. Let's make characters that are dirtbags. Like, there's no way you write this character and think Tom Atkins is like charming. They're
No,
clearly writing him to be an asshole. He's like pretty, if not cheating on his wife, very much
every
sexually
turn.
aggressive towards other women.
Uh
I mean,
huh.
he like the one of the first scenes we're introduced to Atkins' character is when another nurse is walking by him and he slaps her on the ass. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and that's like one of our introduction scenes on him. So we know from the beginning it's not like this is a misconceived notion of like, oh yeah, they tried writing a good guy who just is played a little too smarmy, or the character choices. This guy's clearly written to be a dirtbag. So it's all of these choices just stacked on one on top of the other and top of the other, where you're just left with a movie that just like, it's numbing. I left numbed of this movie because I'm like, there's no actual sense within this movie because nothing's grounding this movie in any form of not only realism, but just in
No.
plain logic or interest. Or because I always have an issue where I'm like, oh, the film doesn't follow a logical point. You can watch this movie and understand what the narrative of this story is. This is not an incomprehensible film, but it is a film that you watched and you're just like, why is
What?
any choice being like, why? Like, what am I doing with my life right now? Is kind of the feeling and headspace you're in.
Why are the leprechauns trying to kill all the children? Why? Like,
Yeah, the leprechauns is the weirdest aspect of this movie because it's not even thematically accurate to Halloween.
no.
It's so like, and they never tie it into anything else. It's just that there's these leprechauns existing. Here's the thing that does work about the horror in the film. I actually think the mask idea is pretty cool. The idea that you
Yeah.
put on these masks and they possess, that is an idea that
Well,
I like in this movie. Go for it, sorry.
well, they don't really possess. More like melt your face into a whole bunch of insects.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess it's not the possession's not the right word.
Okay, but wouldn't it have been so much better? Or not better. This isn't going to fix the movie. I'm not going to take credit for it. But what if the masks instead turned them into like robots and they were like an army or whatever?
Yeah, which was always, you're right, because even when I just said controlled, that's kind of how I thought the movie played out in my head. And then I'm like, you're right, they just kind of melt them into insects and all of this. So it's just like, yeah, it's so interesting because they try this heavy sci-fi thing in the movie, right? This whole
Hmm.
underlying, not underlying, the whole overarching story going on in this movie is that there's these witches that somehow are controlling cyborgs. The cyborgs are in the mask. The masks do what you said. The kids wear the mask. It melts the head off. So it is this whole sci-fi story involving cyborgs. And yet when the final act comes to it, it's not a science fiction final act. You're right. Had they become possessed, that at least possesses something more intonally in line with sci-fi horror. Now you're just in this thing where it's like the only sci-fi element of this movie, which is quite strong, is actually the fact that it's just they're cyborgs. There's no reason for them to be cyborgs. That's just to add a science fiction element that honestly, you strip the cyborgs out of this movie, the movie's the exact same.
Uh huh. Ellie being a cyborg at the end offers nothing.
It's
It's
the You know what I had when watching this scene?
what?
It's another film that does a really similar plot twist in the final act, like almost like a beat for beat, like same plot twist, and has no actual repercussions to the story being told. It's Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, where we just
Yes,
find out the girl is like I don't think she's a cyborg. She's not a
she's a
clone.
clone.
Is she a
She's a
clone?
clone. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the exact same thing in this movie, where it's just like you're watching something. It doesn't actually impact the story. And it's just like, well, there needs to be a science fiction element to this story again. So we're going to have Ellie be a cyborg. How's that actually relate to the story? It doesn't. That's like the thing about this movie. Nothing actually relates to one another.
And also, what is to be taken away from this movie? That you should avoid certain brands when picking out your children's costumes? Like what? Like what is the lesson to be learned here? What is the point of view of this movie? There is no point of view of this movie, Ben.
I
It's just to be weird.
I think you're right. I don't think a movie necessarily needs to have a lesson. I think we're
No,
talking about some
but
of the best horror. Go for it. Sorry.
I no that yeah, that's true. But when it's a horror movie and you've put in so much effort into, obviously the movie wants you to care about the hero succeeding, but why do we want the hero to succeed?
And it's the issue of existing within an anthology because it's just like it's kind of a one and done thing that you don't actually have any real stakes or two.
Uh-huh.
It's also it's the weird thing with the story, right? Where again, a horror film does not have to have meaning behind it, or not necessarily meaning behind it, but it doesn't have to be this the story about morals or anything like that. Same with a science fiction film. But when you're playing with both of those genres in a specific way, it it kind of lends you to believe that there should be something more to this film that's not there. And I think the issue with it for me is it's not there because think the film I think the film actually is trying to tell a story about consumerism. I think that's the biggest failure of this film that you might be hinting towards and maybe skirting around. I think this film is trying to say something about capitalism, about consumerism, about the culture around Halloween, how it's so market driven. Uh, you, all these ideas of the 1980s of capitalism. You spend, you spend, you spend, you get brainwashed, you die. Like money is literally brainwashing you. Consumerism is brainwashing you until your melts and turns into insects. I think that's the idea this movie is trying to convey. The
But
issue
that's
is
the
it's never
thing.
conveyed well.
Yeah, what you just said is infinitely more interesting than what happens in the movie.
And I think the issue is it's just a here's the thing that can often happen. You can watch a film and you can understand what they're trying to do, but there's an incompetency to it. And that's what this film is. It's just incompetent. Anything that could be interesting in this film is completely lackluster because it's incompetent. This film doesn't understand what it has to do to be any form of successful.
Okay, so like movies like The Thing, we keep going back to The Thing because tonally, not tonally, but genre, like it's a similar film by by a person on this production team.
A director who has buy into the success of Halloween 3 is
Yes,
make, yeah.
I care about those characters even though the movie isn't necessarily about morality. I care about what's going on. You can tell, and actually I will argue that that movie, it's studying the human condition in these circumstances.
Yeah, it's the the premise of the thing largely is that it's Carpenter's again obsession with how do people respond in time of crisis and terror? What do they do? What do they not do? And the only ones who can survive the thing are the ones who are again intelligent and can think through a situation with logic and allow their survival instincts to kick in. The ones with survival instincts that survive Carpenter's movies, the ones that don't die in his movies. That's a very big trend in Carpenter's filmography.
I just, I guess I just wish that was in this movie to
Yeah.
some kind of degree, but there's just nothing. There's nothing to be studied here.
Do you know what this movie is? And it's a really weird pop culture reference. It's kind of the larger criticism people have towards Aragon being Lord of the Rings without understanding what makes Lord of the Rings. And that may be a bad comparison because I don't want to specifically attack books that I actually like, but that's what it is to a degree. It is a
I was
it
going to
is a
say I like Aragon.
yeah, no. This is a movie about this is a movie trying to understand who Carpenter is as a filmmaker. This is a guy who clearly understands what type of what interests Carpenter. This editor of the film, not editor, sorry, this director of the film, who was a previous editor for Carpenter, Tommy Lee Wallace, he understands the mind of Carpenter. But the issue is he can't convey the mind of Carpenter. So when you're watching this film, you're watching a guy who understands everything that makes a Carpenter film special, and then when he does it, it doesn't actually make any sense. There's a bunch of like franchises I think now that you can contend that is actually maybe the running point. I know we've had criticisms towards franchises like Fantastic Beast or even like some of the MCU properties or Star Wars, where at times it's just like they understand what makes Star Wars, but they don't understand, or they understand the craft behind a film like Star Wars, but they don't seem to understand how to tell the story of a Star Wars or something like that. Does that make sense to you? Or am I?
That does make sense.
I think that's what this issue of this film is. I'm hesitant to give this film more than about 50 minutes of discussion, which is where we're nearing already. Do you have any final thoughts on this movie that you'd like to talk about before we kind of jump forward?
Um, I do enjoy. When I watch this movie, I do think, oh, this is like Halloween atmosphere, and I like the soundtrack,
I think the
also done by
soundtrack
John Carpenter.
I think the soundtrack's one of the best parts of the movie as well. This is a film where you can also clearly tell it's kind of crazy that this film gets a $2.5 million budget, the same as Halloween 2. It's largely that's the weird thing about this movie. It technically looks good. Like there's not any issue where I look at this film and say this film looks ugly. Now, does this film look a little dated? Of course it does. Every film from the 1970s and 80s with a lower budget has a little bit of an inept, not an ineptness, but an innate cheesy look to it.
Hmm.
Because obviously special effects have grown. Yeah, like I said, there are ideas of this movie that I like. It's clearly trying to be something it's not, and it's trying to be that because it doesn't isn't allowed to exist in the context that it should be allowed to exist in, and that's a body horror film. That's a John Carpenter produced type of film like this, and the issue is this film ends up just being a weird mismatch of a lot of ideas. This feels like a movie that almost has too many cooks in the kitchen where
Yeah,
you're
I feel
watching.
like I don't, since I'm not really interested in this movie, I don't know a lot of the background, but I get the feeling that the folks at Universal wanted more slasher things to relate to Halloween.
I get the sense when I watch this movie that this film, despite just saying that it's written by Tommy Lee Wallace, I have a feeling there was a lot of rewrites on this film. I have a feeling there was a lot of discussion from the studio. There probably was some intervention coming in. There's Carpenter's version, there's Wallace's version. All of this, all these people trying to make a film. There's a film that Wallace is trying to make. There's a film that Carpenter's trying to produce. There's a film that the studio wants to make because they're like, why are we not doing Michael Myers? Like, where's Michael Myers in this film? Maybe it's the only reason that could suggest that why the cult from Halloween 2 is brought up in this movie, because it has no other greater impact in this movie except to kind of tie into Halloween 2 and thus an extent the first one, where it's like, oh yeah, this cult, this holiday, it
Hmm.
exists in this film, so it all ties together. I think the thing that's most upsetting about this film is I watch this film and I'm like, there was actually a premise in this movie. Had this film been done successfully, I think we actually get something. We get a very different Halloween franchise than what we have now, and arguably we might have a way more interesting Halloween franchise if like they understood how to make this film correctly.
Well, definitely as a whole, the Halloween franchise isn't filled with good movies. So I wonder what reality that would be if this movie was a success.
Yeah, I wonder what reality this movie exists like if Season of the Witch is actually like a well received movie. Whether it does crazy box office. Does Universal just essentially just allow John Carpenter to do his thing? They're like, you know what? Every anthology movie, you want to make a horror movie each year for the next 30 years, go for it. Do you want to make The Thing? Fine. That's going to be Halloween The Thing. It's going to be this. You want to make a movie about the Invisible Man? It's going to be Halloween the Invisible Man. All of this scene after scene. Oh, you have an alien story? We're going to do this as a Halloween alien movie. And that's what's so interesting is when I look at this, I then just can connect every film John Carpenter has made post 1982 and look at it and say, yeah, isn't this kind of just like the inspiration that he had for this is the inspiration that he wanted to do with the Halloween franchises. And then when Universal was like, you're never allowed to make another Halloween film that doesn't have Michael Myers, he's like, fine, then I'll just make these types of projects I already had, these anthology horror films that I had. I'll make them somewhere else, and they'll be exactly how I want them to be, and they'll be my focus, and I don't have to worry about studio constraints.
Right.
That's what I feel about when watching this movie. Do you have any closing thoughts before we jump into the great debate?
No.
Then let's do it, Tris. Let's get ready for the great debate. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the great debate. This is where we've prepped a question together. We, taking off that last point that I just mentioned, this idea that Carpenter had an idea for an anthology series that he wanted to do, he wanted to play around with. Let's say Season of the Witch is good. Let's not even say Season of the Witch is good. Let me rephrase that. Let's say Season of the Witch is a huge financial success that inspires Universal to basically be like, you know what, John Carpenter? We don't need Michael Myers. You do your thing every year. Here's your money. We'll leave you alone.
Hmm.
And I told you, Tris, let's plan, let's pitch the next three movies in the Halloween anthology series if Season of the Witch was successful. What are the three next things that Carpenter would want to create, go into, or even if, what do you want to see him do next in the Halloween series if he got his choice?
I don't know if Carpenter would want to do what I came up with. Um, I pretty much only came up with one,
Okay.
uh, just because I had such a hard time thinking creatively.
Mm-hmm.
So I apologize for
No,
that.
you're fine.
But I kind of took inspiration from Batman the Long Halloween and thought of this idea of a murder mystery that happens every Halloween and
Yeah.
it takes place over a couple years and we follow like a beat down investigator who's attached to this case. That's just basically what I came up with.
Okay. So are you keeping one character overarching through a handful of movies? Kind of
Yeah.
doing the Blanc thing from Knives Out where it's like he's going to be
Yeah.
in Glass Onion, but he's not, it's not like, you're going to get Ana de Armas or Jamie Lee Curtis in these movies. It's just going to be him.
Maybe one or two. Like the
Okay.
really this story doesn't need to be more than that.
Understood. I have I came up with 2 to 3 pitches, and they're not even like full on stories. Like this is the story I want to see Carpenter do. It's more of the within horror. What are the three that I want to see Carpenter tackle? I want to see Carpenter do a zombie film. He doesn't
That'd be
have.
cool.
I think he has films that have inspiration in zombie, and maybe there is just one that I'm forgetting that is just a full on zombie film. I would like to see this guy kind of do his version of the Evil Dead. Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead. What that does that look like? What does his special effects creature designs look like in this movie? How does he film it? All of that. I think that is one idea. I wanted to see him. kind of inspired by some of the Universal monster films. I'm really
Like
curious.
Creature of the Black Lagoon?
Not Creature. I was thinking,
No.
what does
Well,
this
I would
guy's.
like that.
I want to see what this guy's Invisible Man looks like. Now, technically, he does Confessions of the Dangerous Mind. Not Confessions of the Dangerous Mind. Jesus, that's a George Clooney directed movie. I meant Confessions of an Invisible Man, I think is the story or the movie, which is stars Chevy Chase. It's much more of a comedy. It's in like 1991. It's pretty bad. But what does Carpenter's Invisible Man look like if it's straight up played as a horror film anthology Halloween? What does the mayhem this guy gets into? How can he do this creepy? How can he basically make something scary? The guy who I would probably consider the master of horror alongside with Hitchcock. How does he make something scary with the unknown? I think the recent film in 2020 did that really well, so I'd be curious to see how Carpenter does that. And the third one, finally, just has to kind of be a preferred choice that I would want to see. I want to see just straight up, what does Carpenter do with like a movie like The Birds? Not The Birds necessarily, but what can he do with animal horror? I think there's so much to be done with like.
I mean, he does a pretty good job in The Thing because I started The Thing thinking, oh my god, puppies.
Yeah, it's. I don't know which animal I would want it, but like, there's so many good films that use. Hey, I don't even know how to describe it. Like The Birds is like to me the classic example. Like what does Carpenter's The Birds look like? How do you take something so non-scary and make them terrifying? Like kind of just the masses. You know what would
What
be
if you
good?
could.
And I
What?
think I fin. What if Carpenter did an underwater movie? Not Creature of the Black Lagoon, but something like that, where it's just like you get that claustrophobic feeling right away because you're underwater. There's
Kind of
this
like
terror,
Jaws then?
kind of like his Jaws.
I just had an idea. Oh, and I lost it.
Oh, you
What?
lost it.
Here, roll back. What were we just talking? What were you just saying
Underwater. We were. I was
before
talking about.
underwater?
I was talking about the idea of like him doing his version of the birds, and then you
Oh,
brought up.
oh.
Okay,
What if M. Night Shyamalan didn't make The Happening, but John Carpenter made The Happening?
it wouldn't be as good. I like The Happening.
I don't like The Happening.
It's fair. It's not a great movie. I I like the idea. It's. I think the interesting thing is that director then asked the same question 12 years later, and was like, Jordan Peele was like, "What if I use the same kind of like elements of like nature to make a horror film with a cloud, right?" Like
Hmm.
it's largely like not obviously the exact same as The Happening, but I think there's some thematic similarities between the two.
I've never seen Nope. I'm assuming
It's
that's what you're talking
I'm
about.
referring to Nope, so I'd be curious to see like it's the hardest form of horror I think to pull out, and I think it's why Nope is just slightly successful, but not all the way successful, is because you're in this world that just doesn't have something that feels tangible as horror, and I think there is something important about something being at the very least tangible, even if you can't see it. And yeah, so that's where I'd be a little hesitant on Carper. But anyway, those are my pitches. Do you want to end there?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, then I say that's it. Thank you guys all for listening to Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. We'll be back next episode with Michael Myers returning for Halloween 4. Is it The Curse of Michael Myers?
The Return of Michael
The
Myers.
Return of Michael Myers. So that's Halloween 4 coming at you guys soon. Thank you all for listening. My name is Ben. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe here from the Beniverse. Thank you, roommate Tris, for joining me. My name is Ben. Take care, guys. Bye bye.
Bye bye.